The wallet hit the floor before Kaien Vale even understood what his hands had done. Rain hammered the windows of Vesper's diner like it had a personal grudge against the glass. The kitchen was running 3 orders behind. The grease trap had overflowed twice. And Kaien's suppressor patch, the thin chemical strip that kept his Omega scent locked behind a chemical wall, was peeling off his neck from the heat. He had 4 minutes to fix all of it. He didn't get 4 minutes. The front door opened. The entire diner went quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet. Not the kind that happens when music stops. This was the kind of quiet that falls when a room full of people simultaneously decides that breathing too loud might get them killed. 3 men walked in. Kaien didn't need to see their faces. He already knew who they were from the way the other waitstaff pressed themselves against the walls. From the way Dex, the overnight cook who had survived 2 armed robberies without flinching, suddenly found something very important to study on the floor tiles. The Dreven triplets had walked into Vesper's diner at 2:14 in the morning. And Kaien Vale, 23 years old, broke, exhausted, and holding a tray of lukewarm coffee, was standing directly in their path. The tallest one moved first. Cassiel Dreven. Raventhorn City called him the Winter Alpha. Not because he was cold in the way people meant when they were being poetic. Because he was cold the way a surgical blade was cold. Efficient. Deliberate. Without apology. He wore a black jacket that probably cost more than Kaien's rent for 6 months. His brothers flanked him, Valor on the left, jaw set tight like he was already deciding who in the room deserved a problem, and Lucefran on the right, mouth curved into something that looked like a smile but moved like a threat. Kaien stepped aside. He did it automatically. Instinct born from years of reading Dangerous Rooms. But the man rushing out of the corner booth behind Cassiel did not step aside. He crashed directly into Kaien's shoulder. The tray went up. Coffee went sideways. And the leather wallet that had been sitting loose on the edge of Cassiel's jacket pocket, barely held by the weight of the flap, fell clean onto the floor between Kaien's feet. Nobody saw it happen. The man who'd bumped into Kaien was already shoving toward the exit, clearly fleeing something. Valor had turned to intercept him. Lucefran was scanning the room. Cassiel had gone completely still, the way a person goes still when they are deciding whether the disruption in front of them is worth their energy. Kaien looked down. The wallet sat there. Black leather. Heavy. The kind of object that radiated money the way certain rooms radiated cold. He should have left it. He knew that, even in the moment. But the medical invoice sitting folded inside his apron pocket had the number $4,200 printed at the bottom of it. Nico's medication. His younger brother. 9 years old, Omega, already showing early onset respiratory complications from living in Raventhorn's lower district air quality. The clinic had already denied the payment extension twice. Kaien's hand moved before his brain finished the argument. He tucked the wallet into his apron. Kept his face flat. Kept walking. He made it to the back hallway. Then the restroom door at the end of the corridor swung open, and Cassiel Dreven stepped out of it. He hadn't been in the dining room at all. There were 2 of them. Kaien's blood dropped 10 degrees. Cassiel's eyes went straight to his apron. Not to his face. Not to his hands. The apron. And the very specific rectangular outline pressing against the fabric. Hi viewers. If someone you loved needed saving and you only had 10 seconds to make a dangerous choice, would you take it? Cassiel didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward Kaien. He just looked at him, and there was something wrong with that look. Something Kaien couldn't immediately name. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the flat, dead-eyed calculation of a man about to give an order. It looked almost like recognition. Who? Cassiel said quietly. Gave you that surname? Kaien didn't answer. He couldn't. Because Cassiel Dreven had just said the one word, surname, like it was a door he'd been standing in front of for years. Like the answer on the other side of it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with a stolen wallet. And Kaien didn't understand why. He made it out of the diner on sheer adrenaline. Cassiel's security team had been redirected by the commotion near the front exit. Valor was outside. Lucran had taken a phone call. The window was 30 seconds wide and Kaien took it without breathing. He ran 4 blocks in the rain before he stopped under a closed laundromat awning. Then he opened the wallet. He expected cash. Maybe a card or two. Something he could use quietly, spend carefully, and feel guilty about for the rest of his life while Nico got his medication and stayed alive. What he found instead froze him to the pavement. The cash was there. But behind it, slotted into a thin leather pocket that wasn't immediately visible, was a flat black drive no bigger than his thumbnail. Encrypted. Branded with a corporate watermark Kaien didn't recognize. He kept going. Behind the drive was a photograph. Old. Worn at the edges. Black and white, the kind of print that came from a physical darkroom. 2 men stood together in what looked like an office. One was tall, square-jawed, with the kind of bearing that said old money and power in the same breath. He had a small pin on his lapel, the Dreven family crest. Kaien had seen it on enough news broadcasts to know it without thinking. The man beside him was leaner. And the woman standing at the edge of the frame, half cut off, like she'd stepped into the shot by accident, was wearing a coat Kaien had seen in a photograph his entire life. His mother's coat. The gray wool one with the double-breasted buttons. The one she'd worn in the only picture he had of her from before she disappeared. Kaien's hands were shaking. He read the note tucked behind the photo last. 7 words. Written in clean, controlled handwriting that still managed to feel urgent. If he's alive, don't let them find him. Kaien stood there in the rain for a long time. Then the black car pulled up to the curb. Not fast. Not aggressive. It just appeared, the way expensive things appeared in Raventhorn, like they had always been there, and you were only now allowed to see them. The window came down. Cassiel looked out at him. Rain on his jacket. No expression. 2 of his security team stepped out of the vehicle behind the car. Kaien's legs tensed. Don't, Cassiel said. Not to Kaien. To his own men. They stopped. Cassiel stepped out of the car alone. He walked to Kaien without hurry, without threat. Which was somehow worse than if he'd come at him running. He held out his hand. Kaien considered running for exactly 2 seconds before realizing that would be one of the last things he ever did in this city. He handed over the wallet. Cassiel didn't open it. He already knew what was there. He tucked it inside his jacket, and then he did something that made 0 sense given every rule of power Kaien had ever learned about this city. He looked past Kaien to the 2 security guards who had just appeared at the corner behind him. Not Cassiel's men, different men, no visible allegiance, and he said something into his earpiece. They disappeared in under 10 seconds. Kaien hadn't even known he was being followed. Come inside, Cassiel said. That's not a question. No, Cassiel agreed. It isn't. But then he turned toward the diner across the street, not back to the car, and he stopped at the door and waited. Like he was actually giving Kaien the space to decide. Inside, he ordered without looking at the menu. He ordered enough food for 2 people. He set it in front of Kaien without ceremony and sat across from him with his hands flat on the table. Kaien hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He hated that his body gave him away. He hated more that Cassiel noticed and said nothing about it. They sat in silence for a full minute before Cassiel spoke. Your mother's name was Avelini Vale. It wasn't a question either. Kaien's fork stopped moving. She worked with my father, Cassiel continued, before someone removed both of them from the situation permanently. He said it without emotion, The kind of practice delivery that told Kaien this man had learned to discuss devastating things as though discussing weather. The drive in that wallet, Cassiel added, contains records that certain people would dissolve this entire city to keep buried. He looked at Kaien directly then. And you've been carrying your mother's last name in a city that has been watching for it since before you were old enough to understand why. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once. Outside, rain hit the glass. Cassiel's voice dropped lower. If the board learns you exist, they'll kill you before sunrise. Kaien started noticing the changes 3 days later. The debt collectors who had been circling his apartment building for 2 weeks. 2 large men who showed up every evening and stood near the entrance just long enough for Kaien to feel their presence in his chest before he even got home, were gone. Not relocated. Gone. His landlord called on a Tuesday morning and said, in a tone that suggested he was as confused as he was pleased, that Kaien's rent had been paid through the next 4 months. Anonymous wire transfer. No name attached. The pharmacy called Thursday. Nico's medication was ready. Fully covered. Kaien stood in the pickup line with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight, and the very clear knowledge that someone with significant money was quietly restructuring his life without asking his permission. He told himself he didn't know who. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. Cassiel Dreven didn't announce what he was doing. There was no message. No meeting request. No sleek black car pulling up while Kaien walked to work. The protection arrived the way weather arrived. You didn't see it coming, you only noticed it when the damage that should have happened didn't. Word spread through the district anyway. That was the problem with Raventhorn's underground. It had ears in places most people forgot to check. By the end of the second week, the whispers had cycled back to Kaien through 3 different sources. The Winter Alpha chose someone. He heard it first from a kitchen porter named Deshawn who worked 2 buildings over. Then from a woman who managed the corner pharmacy where Nico's doctor had privileges. Then directly, uncomfortably directly, from Morel Voss, who appeared inside Vesper's diner on a Friday evening wearing a coat that cost more than the diner's monthly operating budget and chose the seat at Kaien's station specifically. Morel was what Raventhorn called elite. Old Omega family. Connected to the Dreven name through his late father's business alliances. Beautiful in the cold, architectural way that people with generational wealth sometimes were. Like every feature had been arranged for maximum impact rather than warmth. He smiled at Kaien like he was something mildly interesting he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. So you're the diner worker? Morel said without preamble. Kaien filled his water glass without looking at him directly. Can I get you something? Cassiel has terrible taste in charity projects. Morel picked up the menu. You're going to burn yourself thinking you're protected. He loses interest eventually. Everyone who gets close to him learns that. He said it pleasantly. Like he was discussing seasonal specials. Kaien set the water down. Are you ready to order? Morel looked up at him then, fully, for the first time. And something shifted in his expression. The pleasantness tightened slightly. The last Omega he paid attention to disappeared, Morel said. Not metaphorically. He placed an order Kaien knew he would never eat, and then he left a tip that was precisely $1, and he walked out. Kaien cleared the table with steady hands and a loud mind. That evening, near the end of his shift, Cassiel came in. No brothers. 2 guards stationed outside. He sat at the counter, not a booth, which was the first thing that surprised Kaien. No performance of space. No commanded distance. He ordered black coffee. He read something on his phone. He was quiet. Kaien refilled his cup without being asked. And then Cassiel set down his phone, reached across the counter without warning, and straightened Kaien's collar, the loose fold of his uniform that had been bothering Kaien for the last hour, and that he'd kept meaning to fix between tables. It lasted 2 seconds. Either of them acknowledged it. But for the rest of the shift, Kaien caught himself cataloging things. The way Cassiel kept track of the room without appearing to look at it. The way he'd already memorized the names of the other staff from a single prior visit. The way he finished his coffee and then sat for another 20 minutes doing nothing, which for a man who ran 3 crime empires simultaneously had to mean something. Then, halfway through the walk home, Kaien passed the building entrance and stopped. A woman from 4B was loading boxes into a car. She glanced at him briefly and then away, which meant nothing. But the man in the parked vehicle 20 feet back was sitting too still. Too casually. Watching the entrance in the way people who were paid to watch things. Not Cassiel's people. He knew what Cassiel's security looked like now. The cut of the jacket. The angle they kept their hands. This was different. Kaien kept walking. Didn't speed up. Didn't look back. He reached his apartment, locked both deadbolts, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment. Then Nico padded out of his room half asleep, hair pressed flat on one side, and climbed onto the bed next to him and said nothing. Kaien put his arm around him. In the ceiling light of the hallway, he caught the reflection of his own window. And in the reflection, small, mounted low in the corner of the window frame, a red pinprick blinked once. Then went dark. He hadn't put anything there. Someone had been inside his apartment. And they'd left something behind. Kaien didn't sleep. He spent the 3 hours before dawn on his bathroom floor with his phone and a name he'd pulled from a single line in the encrypted files he'd managed to photograph before handing the drive back. Elian Rowe. The search results were thin. Deliberately thin, the kind of thin that happened when records got adjusted rather than deleted. A small social presence, scrubbed back to almost nothing. A public statement from a Raventhorn social welfare office 18 months ago, labeling Elian as having experienced a mental health episode requiring long-term supervised care. No location. No family statement. No follow-up. Just a man who had, from what Kaien could piece together through 3 layers of redirected links, worked in financial oversight connected to driven corporate accounts. And then stopped existing publicly on the same week he'd reportedly flagged irregular payment transfers to an unnamed offshore account. Kaien stared at the screen. The camera in his window was still there. He hadn't touched it. If he removed it, whoever planted it would know he'd found it. Better to let them think he hadn't. He got up. Made Nico breakfast. Sent him to school. Walked to work in the rain. At 4:47 p.m., 3 blocks from Vespers, a dark vehicle swerved hard across the intersection ahead of him. Not an accident. 2 men stepped out of a separate car on the right side, the cut of their clothing wrong for the neighborhood, the way they moved too coordinated to be coincidental, and Kaien processed all of it in about 1 second before his body locked up entirely. Then a black armored car came off the cross street hard and stopped directly between Kaien and the 2 men. The door opened. Cassiel was already looking at him from inside. "Get in." Kaien got in. The door shut. The car moved. It was quiet inside the way expensive, armored things were quiet. Total sound cancellation, the world outside reduced to a distant visual. Cassiel was watching him. Not with urgency. Not with the tight jaw of someone who just narrowly avoided a firefight. Just watching, the way he always watched, with that still and measuring attention that Kaien had stopped being able to dismiss as mere calculation. Kaien's right hand was bleeding slightly. He'd scraped it on the car door without realizing. Cassiel reached across the seat. He didn't ask. He just took Kaien's hand carefully, like the hand was something that required handling, and peeled back the torn edge of his glove. He examined the scrape for a moment, then removed a small kit from the interior panel and cleaned it without ceremony. Kaien watched his own hand being tended by the most dangerous man in Raventhorn City. Neither of them spoke for a full block. Ellie and Ro, Kaien finally said. Cassiel's hand stilled for 1 second. Then continued. What about him? He found something in your accounts. And then he disappeared. Cassiel set the kit back in the panel. He didn't look away. Yes, he said. Kaien waited. He came to me first, Cassiel said. I told him to go through protected channels. That I would back him. A pause. 1 beat. I was overruled. By who? Cassiel was quiet for a moment that stretched. By people I was still trusting at that time, he said. The word was landed differently than the rest of the sentence. Past tense in a way that held weight. Outside the window, Raventhorn moved past in wet light and neon. A city that looked glamorous from the elevated highway and looked like exhaustion from the street level. Kaien leaned his head back. Why does your security watch my apartment window? My security, Cassiel said, is not the team that placed the camera. Kaien turned to look at him directly. Cassiel met his eyes. Someone placed it 3 days before I paid your rent, Cassiel said. Which means they were already watching you before I made the decision to protect you visible. The car turned. The city lights shifted. That means someone else knew who you were before I confirmed it. Kaien processed that. Which means, Cassiel said quietly, that you've been on a list somewhere for a very long time. The car pulled into an underground garage. Clean. Private. Lit in amber. Kaien stepped out. He noticed 2 of Cassiel's guards standing at precise angles near the elevator. Relaxed in posture but positioned with the kind of exact spacing that was trained, not casual. They looked at Cassiel with the specific expression of men who feared their employer and would also, without question, die for him. That contradiction had been sitting in the back of Kaien's mind since the diner. He filed it away. Later that night, alone in his apartment with Nico asleep down the hall, Kaien sat at his small table and opened his laptop. He ran the corporate watermark from the flash drive through 3 separate image search tools. The results came back clean. All of them. Not nothing. Clean. Someone had scrubbed it. Kaien drummed 2 fingers on the table. Ellie and Ro had found something and been made to disappear. His mother had found something and been made to disappear. And now Kaien was sitting in an apartment with a surveillance camera he hadn't placed, in a city where the most dangerous alpha in the underground had decided, for reasons still not fully explained, that Kaien Vale was worth protecting. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it. Let it ring out. 30 seconds later, a text arrived from the same number. No words. Just a file name. Driven_air_internal_board_minutes_year 4. And then the message deleted itself. Cassiel came to him 2 nights later. No car. No security team visible. He appeared at the back entrance of Vesper's diner 20 minutes before Kaien's shift ended, and he waited without announcement, which Dex the cook noticed and chose to say absolutely nothing about. Kaien found him sitting on the back steps in the alley, rain-damp, jacket undone, looking like a man who had been doing calculations in his head for hours and had finally run out of ways to avoid the answer. They walked. No direction in particular. Just the city at 2 a.m., wet sidewalks and closed storefronts, and the distant base of a club somewhere past the financial district. Cassiel started speaking without preamble. My father built the Driven Empire on 2 things, he said. Money, and the fear that he would take it from anyone who moved against him. He kept his eyes forward. What I didn't know until I was 19 was that there was a 3rd leg. A board of 7 men, finance, federal oversight, private security, political lobbying, who had funded the Empire's earliest expansions in exchange for something my father never should have agreed to. Kaien said nothing. Let him move at his own speed. They ran a procurement network beneath the Empire's financial shell. Omega children, mostly. Removed from lower district housing under fabricated foster system interventions. Sold to private clients with enough money and protection to stay invisible. Cassiel's jaw moved. My father found out what they were actually doing in year 4 of the arrangement. He refused to continue covering it. He stopped walking. He was dead within 6 months. Ruled a cardiac event. He was 39. The rain picked up slightly. I inherited the Empire at 22, Cassiel said. And the board inherited me. They assumed I would be manageable. His voice dropped flat. I spent 3 years pretending they were right while I rebuilt every intelligence network my father had used and about a dozen he hadn't. He looked at Kaien then. Your mother was the internal auditor who helped my father build the documentation that was supposed to expose them. She completed the records. She hid the genetic identification files, biological markers that could directly tie certain board members to specific children who had been processed through the network. Kaien's chest felt very tight. The files were never submitted, Cassiel said, because she disappeared before she could. A delivery truck moved through the far intersection. The city breathed. The records she hid, Cassiel continued, were coded, split into 2 parts. One half was on the drive in my wallet. He paused. The other half is biological. He looked at Kaien the way someone looked at a person when they were delivering news they had been carrying alone for longer than was reasonable. It's in you, Cassiel said. Not metaphorically. She encoded the second half of the identification sequence into your genetic profile. A modification made before you were born. Kaien stared at him. You are the second key, Cassiel said. The board has known it was theoretically possible since my father's files were partially recovered. They have been looking for you, specifically for a surviving child of Avalini Vale, for 11 years. The weight of that settled over Kaien like something physical. 11 years old. That was how young he'd been when people with power and money had already put his name on a list. He pressed his back against the wet brick of the building behind him and stared at the space above the roofline where the sky went orange from city light. The camera in my apartment, he said, was placed by a contractor working for a board member. Cassiel confirmed. We identified the source 4 days ago. The contractor has been redirected. Kaien looked at him. Cassiel held his gaze. Steady. I watched people fear me for years, he said, because fear kept them alive. He said it without pride, without apology, like a man reading a fact about himself that he had come to understand more clearly with age. It also kept me from being able to move against the board directly. Every time I got close, they leaked something, threatened someone, used my own empire's reputation against me. He stopped. You changed that, he said. The complete record, both halves, is enough to dismantle every federal protection they bought. Every fabricated case. Every disappeared name. He didn't say if you help me. He didn't frame it like a transaction. He just said it. Like Kaien deserved to know the full shape of the thing before deciding what to do with it. And that, more than the rent paid, more than the debt collectors removed, more than the glove peeled back carefully in the back of an armored car, was what cracked something open in Kaien's chest. Not romance. Not safety. Respect. He had been given information that could get him killed, delivered straight, with no softening and no manipulation. By a man who could have simply moved pieces around him like furniture and never said a word. Kaien exhaled. And your brothers, he said. Do they know all of this? Something shifted in Cassiel's face. Small. Barely visible. But Kaien caught it. because he had been watching Cassiel driven long enough by now to understand that the smallest movements were the ones that carried the most weight. Valor knows enough, Cassiel said carefully. He did not say Lucerin's name. Kaien noticed. He filed it precisely, the way he had been filing things for days. Because somewhere in the city behind them, in a building Kaien would not be able to identify on a map, Luceren Driven was sitting across a table from men whose names were on the same board Cassiel had spent 3 years preparing to destroy. And he was smiling. Nico was gone before Kaien got home. The front door was unlocked. One shoe was sitting in the hallway, just one, the left one, the green one Nico had insisted on wearing every day for the past month. And that detail, that single small shoe on the floor without its pair, was what broke something open in Kaien's chest before his brain had even finished processing the scene. The apartment was clean. Undisturbed. No sign of a struggle. That was almost worse. A struggle meant resistance. No struggle meant whoever took Nico had been fast enough, or trusted enough, that the boy hadn't had time to fight back. Kaien called Cassiel. 1 ring. Someone took Nico. A pause. 3 seconds. Don't move. The line went dead. 14 minutes later, Kaien had been counting. Cassiel walked through the front door. Not security first. Him. He moved through the apartment quickly, said nothing to Kaien directly, spoke 2 sentences into his earpiece, and then stood still in the center of the room and looked at Kaien with the specific expression of a man making a rapid decision between 2 options that both cost something. He chose. They took him to the Veldir building. 4th sublevel. The syndicate uses it for holding, short-term, not processing. He said this with a certainty that meant his people had already been tracking this location. We move in 20 minutes. We, Kaien said. Cassiel looked at him. You're not leaving me here, Kaien said. Not a question. Cassiel didn't argue. Valor was already at the building when they arrived. He had the specific jaw set of a man who had been trying to control a violent impulse for the last hour, and was running low on reasons to keep holding it. He looked at Kaien once, measured him in about 2 seconds, and then turned back to the floor plan on his tablet without comment. The extraction took 11 minutes. Kaien waited in the car because Cassiel told him to and because he understood, barely, and with enormous effort, that being in that building would make him a liability rather than an asset. He sat in the back seat in the dark and watched the building entrance, and said nothing. Then Cassiel came out. With Nico. The boy was asleep. Fully asleep, not unconscious. His mouth was slightly open the way it always was when he crashed hard, his head on Cassiel's shoulder, one arm hanging loose. Cassiel carried him the way someone carried a thing they understood was fragile, and did not want to damage. He set Nico gently in the back seat beside Kaien. He didn't say anything about it. He got in the front. He gave the driver an address. Kaien looked down at his brother's face, the slow breath, the complete and exhausted peace of a child who had been scared and then had that fear removed, and he felt something shift inside him that he couldn't fully name yet. He looked up at the back of Cassiel's head. I stopped feeling afraid, Kaien said quietly, when you walked into the room. Cassiel went very still in the front seat. He didn't respond. But his right hand, resting on the console, moved slightly. Like he'd started to reach for something and then stopped himself. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Nico slept through all of it. Back at the safe house, Cassiel sat in the kitchen while Kaien settled Nico into one of the back rooms. When Kaien came back out, Cassiel was on the phone, speaking in the flat, clipped tone he used when giving instructions to people who understood the cost of not following them. He ended the call. Set the phone down. Looked at the table for a moment. Luceren attended a private meeting last Thursday, Cassiel said. With Dade Prentice. He paused. Prentice runs external contracts for the board. Kaien sat down slowly. He's been feeding them positioning data, Cassiel said. Not intelligence. Not names. Just timing. Where I would be. When I would be distracted. He said it without expression, but his hands on the table were completely flat. Pressed down. Like he was keeping them from doing something else. And then the news alert hit every screen in the safe house simultaneously. Breaking, Draven Empire implicated in Omega trafficking network. Internal sources confirm Cassiel Draven directed procurement operations. Cassiel looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at Kaien. And the thing Kaien saw in his face was not panic. Not rage. It was a man who had been waiting for this exact move and had still, somehow, despite everything, hoped he was wrong about when it would come. The city moved fast when it turned. By morning, Raventhorn's 3 major news platforms had run the story across every format. Digital. Print. Broadcast. The framing was consistent. Too consistent, the kind of consistent that meant a single source had packaged it and distributed it pre-written to multiple outlets simultaneously. Cassiel Draven, the story said, had used his empire's financial infrastructure to fund and manage Omega child procurement on behalf of anonymous clients. Internal sources? Corroborated documentation. A federal oversight board calling for immediate asset seizure. Pause on that. The Federal Oversight Board. The one whose director was on the list Kaien had pulled from the encrypted drive. Within 6 hours, 2 of Cassiel's political allies issued public statements of distance. A banking partner froze cooperative accounts. The city's Alpha Council, a largely ceremonial body that nonetheless controlled public narrative, in Raventhorn's elite circles, called for an emergency session. Rival syndicates stopped making threats. They started making plans. Kaien watched all of it from the safe house's main room, moving between screens and the notes he'd been building for the last 72 hours. He had 3 separate document threads open, the financial records from the drive, the genetic identification coding his mother had embedded in the network's procurement logs, and a growing map of transaction pathways connecting board members to falsified Omega psychiatric cases going back 9 years. He was not a passive piece in this anymore. That had shifted somewhere between a rescued shoe in a hallway and a man carrying his sleeping brother out of a sublevel holding room. Morel Voss appeared on screen at 11 a.m. in a live interview that Kaien was fairly certain had been scheduled before the story even broke. He sat in front of cameras in a tailored gray suit and confirmed, with careful, practiced sadness, that he had personally witnessed concerning behavior within the Draven organization over a period of years. That he had hoped things would change. That he had, ultimately, felt he had no choice but to speak. Morel never named a specific act. Never gave a specific date. Just impressions. Feelings. The kind of testimony that was legally insulated and publicly devastating. Kaien turned the volume down. He pulled up the falsified psychiatric case files. Elian Rowe's file was there. 3 others he hadn't identified yet. And one name near the bottom of the 3rd document that stopped him completely. Thomas Voss. Age 14 at time of removal. Omega classification. Lower district housing. Placed in supervised care following psychiatric evaluation. Morel's last name. That was worth sitting with for a moment. Kaien kept going. He cross-referenced Thomas Voss against the financial transaction map. The placement had been funded through a shell account connected to, and this was the part that required reading twice, the Voss family's own charitable foundation. Morel hadn't just witnessed the network. He had used it. And now he was on camera protecting it by burning Cassiel publicly before the real records could surface. Kaien closed the laptop. He walked to where Cassiel was standing at the far window, watching the city. He set the printed file on the surface beside him. Cassiel looked at it. He didn't react with surprise, which meant he'd either known or suspected. Kaien couldn't tell which. The syndicate's director, Kaien said. The Federal Oversight Board. What's his name? Cassiel turned from the window. Aldrich Fenn, he said. He's been in that position for 11 years. 11 years. The same timeline Cassiel had given him before. The same window in which Kaien's mother had disappeared, Elian Rowe had been erased, and a list of children had moved through falsified systems into places no one was supposed to find them. Kaien looked at him directly. I know where the second financial ledger is, he said. The one that links Fenn's department to the shell accounts directly. He paused. I've known for 3 days. I needed to verify the chain of custody before using it. Cassiel was quiet for a moment. You've been building the case. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. By yourself? I didn't know who else to trust, Kaien said plainly. You were dealing with Luz Fran. Valor was managing the extraction fallout. And I had time and a laptop and 11 years of reasons to want this finished. Cassiel looked at him. And something in his expression, that always controlled, always measuring face, shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way people in stories broke open all at once. Just a slight release. Like a door that had been held shut from the inside for a very long time, easing off its frame by 1 inch. The board's summit, Cassiel said. Fenn has called one for Friday. All 7 members. Under the guise of formalizing the asset seizure process. They'll all be in the same room, Kaien said. Yes. That's the window. Cassiel nodded once. Outside, Raventhorn kept moving. Kept broadcasting. Kept turning against a man whose empire, for all its weight, had spent 3 years quietly trying to dismantle the thing the city was now accusing it of building. And somewhere in a building Kaien still hadn't been to, Aldrich Fenn was about to realize he had made the specific mistake of gathering every person who needed to be exposed into a single room on a single day. The board convened at 9 a.m. in the Centaura Tower's 42nd floor conference room. Floor-to-ceiling glass. 6 security checkpoints. A guest list that required federal clearance to access and had been leaked to Kaien's contact inside the building's IT infrastructure at 6:47 that morning. That matters. Because by 8:55, 3 separate data pipelines were live. One running through a journalist Kaien had spent 2 days vetting, Brennan Okafor, independent, with a documented history of protecting sources and a hatred of institutional corruption that read less like ideology and more like personal history. One running through a federal terminal connected to an oversight body that was not Fenn's department. And one live broadcast feed routed through Kaien's laptop to a dark web mirror that would push the data publicly the moment it was verified. Cassiel walked into that building through the front entrance. That decision. That was the one Kaien had argued against at 3 a.m. They want you there, he'd said. The whole setup is designed to make the seizure look procedurally clean. If you walk in. If I don't walk in, Cassiel had said. The board controls the narrative for another 48 hours. And 48 hours is enough time to disappear evidence and discredit every source we have. He hadn't been wrong. So he walked in. With Valor 3 steps behind him and no visible emotion on his face. The board received him the way people received things they believed they had already won, politely. With the particular warmth of men who thought the person across from them didn't understand the shape of the trap they were standing in. Aldrich Fenn sat at the head of the table. 61. Federal credentials displayed on the wall behind him. The kind of man who had been in power long enough that he'd stopped seeing other people as people and started seeing them as variables. He shook Cassiel's hand. He began the formal proceedings. Kaien was in a vehicle 3 blocks away. He watched the feed from a small camera Cassiel wore in his lapel pin, and he ran the final verification on the financial ledger, and his hands were completely steady, which surprised him. Fen started reading the asset seizure framework. Cassiel let him get through the first paragraph. Then he placed a single drive on the table. "Before we proceed," Cassiel said, "I'd like the board to review the complete transaction records for the Valenine Shell accounts, spanning year 1 through year 11 of current oversight operations." Fen's expression didn't change. It was the stillness of a man managing a reaction, not the stillness of a man who had nothing to react to. "Those records don't exist in recoverable form," Fen said evenly. "They do now," Cassiel said. "Both halves." Kaien pushed the first data release. On the screens embedded in the conference room walls, the ones that displayed procedural documents during formal board sessions, the financial ledger opened. Transaction by transaction. Name by name. Shell account to real account. Fabricated case number to real child. Real child to private client purchase record. 11 years. In full. One of the board members stood up immediately. 2 others reached for phones. Fen remained seated. He looked at Cassiel across the table, and the thing in his expression was no longer controlled warmth. It was the specific cold of a man calculating whether there was still an exit he hadn't accounted for. "The federal terminal feed is already live," Cassiel said. "Brennan Okafor's publication runs the story in 40 minutes regardless of what happens in this room. And the public mirror goes live on verification completion, which happened." He checked nothing, just said it. 4 minutes ago. Fen picked up his phone. The communications block went up at 8:52. Cassiel said, "You won't reach anyone who can stop it." Silence. Real silence. The kind that meant the room understood it was over. The doors opened. Federal agents, not Fen's department, the other one, the one that had been quietly briefed over the prior 72 hours, came in from 2 entrances. 3 board members immediately moved toward compliance. 2 tried the exits anyway. 1 sat down and put his face in his hands. Fen stood slowly. He looked at Cassiel one last time. "You burned your own empire," he said. "No," Cassiel said. "I burned yours." Kaien exhaled in the vehicle 3 blocks away. He watched the feed. He watched the agents move. He watched Valer stay exactly where he was, hands visible, jaw set, waiting. Then his phone buzzed. A message from a number he recognized as one of Cassiel's secondary contacts. "Luz Fran is in the building. Sublevel 2. He came in through the service entrance 40 minutes ago. He's been tracking Fen's private security rotation." Kaien sat up. He flagged the armed contractor Fen had positioned outside the stairwell on 42. The message continued. The one who was waiting for the signal to move on Cassiel. Luz Fran removed him. Kaien read it twice. Not betrayal. Not execution. Luz Fran had been inside the building. Quietly. Working an angle none of them had known about. And when the moment came, when the contractor raised his weapon in the stairwell 3 floors below the conference room, Luz Fran had been there. He took the shot meant for his brother. The message came through 30 seconds later. "He's alive. Critical. Valer has him." Kaien pressed his hand flat against the seat in front of him. He thought about all the things he'd concluded about Luz Fran. All the patterns he'd mapped. The meeting with Prentice. The positioning data. He'd been right about the meeting. He'd been wrong about why. Luz Fran had been building his own counter-operation from inside the Syndicate's trust. Feeding them enough to maintain access. Pulling out the one piece they needed most, the location of Fen's insurance contractor, without ever tipping his hand to Cassiel, because if Cassiel had known, his reaction would have made Lucerin's cover collapse. The sacrifice had been deliberate. Lucran had known exactly what that stairwell cost. Kaien looked at the feed. Cassiel was still standing at the table, watching the agents process the room. And then someone told him. Kaien watched the moment Cassiel heard about his brother. He didn't collapse. He didn't move dramatically. He just stopped. Completely still. And the thing that crossed his face was not the controlled, surgical calm he wore everywhere. It was something older than that. Rawer. The look of a man who had spent 3 years believing one of the only people left in his life had chosen the wrong side, and had just discovered that the cost of being wrong about that was already paid. He left the room without another word. And Kaien, 3 blocks away, pressed his phone to his chest and sat in the quiet and let the weight of all of it land exactly where it needed to. Weeks passed. Raventhorn restructured the way cities restructured after exposure. Loudly at first, then quietly, then in ways that were harder to see. Federal proceedings began. Asset freezes were contested, and then confirmed. 3 board members entered plea arrangements. 2 disappeared into the kind of legal process that moves slower than justice but eventually, theoretically, arrived somewhere. Aldrich Fenn was charged on 41 counts. Fenn's name stayed in the news for exactly as long as these stories stayed in the news, which was long enough for people to understand what had happened and not long enough for most of them to understand why it had taken 11 years. Lucran was in a private medical facility outside the city. Recovering. Valor hadn't left the building since the day Lucran went in. He slept in the facility's family wing. He ate from the cafeteria. He answered work communications from the hallway. Kaien heard this secondhand through a brief message from one of Cassiel's remaining security team. Cassiel himself had gone quiet. Not unreachable. His legal team was operating. The Empire's legitimate holdings were being managed. Evidence submissions were moving through proper channels on schedule. But Cassiel, the person, was not visible. No cars. No appearances. No contact. Nico asked about him on the 3rd Tuesday. They were eating dinner, rice and chicken, the meal Kaien made when he had time to cook and not just enough time to survive, and Nico looked up from his plate with the direct, uncomplicated attention that children applied to questions adults avoided. "The man who carried me," Nico said. "Is he coming back?" Kaien set down his fork. "I don't know." Nico considered this. "He was tired," Nico said. "Like the really tired. Not sleep tired. The other kind." Kaien looked at him. "Do monsters get tired too?" Nico asked. Not cruelly. Not even with awareness that it was a complicated question. Just asking. The way 9-year-olds ask things that took adults years to reach. Kaien thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "I think they do." The nights were harder. He didn't let himself examine why, exactly. But Cassiel's coat was still on the hook by the door. Left behind on the night of the board summit, never retrieved, and Kaien had not moved it once in 3 weeks. He told himself it was because there hadn't been a convenient moment to return it. He was lying to himself again. He knew Cassiel's scent. That was the truth he didn't say out loud to anyone. He'd learned it without trying, the way you learn the particular sound of a specific person's footsteps in a hallway. Cedar. Cold air. Something metallic underneath, like the inside of an expensive car. On the street twice he caught himself checking for black cars at intersections. Not out of fear. Out of something else entirely. The city was different now. Quieter in some ways. Louder in others. The kinds of people who had moved through Raventhorn's lower districts with a particular entitlement had recalibrated their behavior. At least visibly, at least for now. The clinic had expanded its Omega health services. 3 of the falsified psychiatric cases were being formally reviewed. Small things. Real things. The drive data had done what Kaien's mother had spent years trying to make it do. He thought about that on a Friday night, sitting at his small kitchen table with a cup of tea and the city visible through the window in the specific orange-gray of a rainy Raventhorn evening. He thought about a woman he only knew from a single photograph and a gray wool coat and a 7-word note in a leather wallet. She had made him the key to the lock she was building. She had trusted him with it before he was born. He hadn't failed her. That settled over him slowly. Not triumph. Just the quiet of something finished that needed to be finished. Then, at 11:43 p.m., he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. Not his neighbor, wrong rhythm, wrong weight. Not building maintenance, too late, too deliberate. They stopped outside his door. And then nothing. No knock. No voice. Just presence. Kaien sat very still at his kitchen table. He looked at the coat on the hook by the door. Then he got up. He opened the door. Cassiel looked like someone had turned the Empire off. Not broken. Not damaged in any visible way. But the architecture was gone, the careful, constructed distance that Kaien had spent weeks learning to read around. The jacket was plain. Dark. No security earpiece. A cut above his left eyebrow that had been taped but not properly dressed. He was alone. He stood in the hallway and looked at Kaien and said nothing for a long moment, and Kaien understood without being told that this was not a man who knew how to arrive at a place like this. Who knew how to stand at a door without armor and wait for it to open toward him rather than because of him. Kaien stepped aside. Cassiel came in. He sat at the kitchen table, same chair Kaien had been in 30 seconds ago, and he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Not at Kaien. "Lucerin's going to make it," he said. "I heard." A pause. "He was building the counter-operation for 8 months," Cassiel said. "He didn't tell me because he knew I would move too fast," he said. He stopped. Started again. "He said I always move too fast when the people I care about are in danger." He said this with a complicated expression that Kaien read as a man recognizing an accurate criticism. "He was right," Kaien said. Cassiel looked up at that. Not offended. Just surprised, slightly, that Kaien would say it plainly. "Yeah," Cassiel said. He was. The heater in the kitchen wall made its specific rattling sound, the one that had been getting worse for a month and that the building super had promised 3 separate times to fix. Kaien got up without saying anything, moved to the heater panel, and did the thing that actually worked, firm pressure on the bottom left corner, held for 4 seconds until the rattle settled. He turned back. Cassiel was watching him. "You know how to fix that," Cassiel said. "I've lived here for 3 years. He made coffee. He did it the way he always did it, the cheap drip machine that took 6 minutes, the specific amount of grounds that made it strong without being bitter, the 2 mugs from the cabinet that didn't match each other. He set one in front of Cassiel. Cassiel wrapped his hands around it. He didn't drink it right away. Just held it. "I didn't know how to exist," he said, "without the war being there." Kaien sat down across from him. "Every morning for 12 years, Cassiel said, "I woke up and the first thing my brain did was assess threats. Before I was fully awake. Just," he made a small, precise gesture with one hand. "Running the numbers. Who needed managing? What was moving? Where the pressure points were." He looked at his coffee. "The last 3 weeks, I kept doing it. And the threat list kept coming back empty." He paused. "I didn't know what to do with that." Kaien understood this in a way he didn't try to explain. He'd spent his own years running different numbers. Medical costs. Rent gaps. Nico's medication schedule. The daily arithmetic of surviving on not enough. That arithmetic had been so constant for so long that the absence of it felt less like relief and more like a missing weight he kept reaching for and not finding. "It takes time," Kaien said. learning that the quiet is safe. Cassiel looked at him. Really looked. The way he looked at things he was trying to understand rather than things he was trying to manage. "You're doing it too," he said. "Yes." From down the hall, Nico's door opened. The small sound of a child waking up confused and half asleep, padding toward the kitchen for water, the routine Kaien knew by heart. Nico appeared in the doorway. He saw Cassiel. He looked at him for a moment. Then at Kaien. Then back at Cassiel. "You came back," Nico said. Flatly. Like this was a fact he was confirming for his own records. Cassiel looked at the boy. "Yeah," he said. Nico seemed to decide this was acceptable. He got his water from the counter, drank half of it standing up, set the glass down with the specific gravity of a 9-year-old who had made his peace with the situation, and went back to bed. Cassiel watched him go. And something happened in his face, not large, not performed. Just a softening that moved through the eyes first, and then settled. Like a thing finally releasing. They stayed at the table for a while after that. The coffee went cool. The heater didn't rattle again. The city outside moved at its own pace, the orange-gray of Raventhorn at rest, and neither of them filled the silence with anything it didn't need. At some point, Kaien got up to take the mugs to the sink. When he came back, Cassiel was asleep in the chair. Head dropped slightly. Hands still on the table. Breathing slow and even. The most feared alpha in Raventhorn City. The man who had run a shadow empire for 12 years. Who had watched his father die, rebuilt everything from the ground up, carried the weight of a conspiracy he hadn't created and spent years trying to dismantle without revealing his hand. He was asleep at a small kitchen table in a lower district apartment. Because he was tired. The real tired. The other kind. Kaien stood there for a moment. Then he got the blanket from the back of the couch, worn, dark blue, the one Nico always stole, and he draped it over Cassiel's shoulders without waking him. He sat back down. He looked out the window at the city. And for the first time in his life, the most dangerous man in Raventhorn looked peaceful. Somewhere across the city, in a locked room inside what remained of Fenn's federal network, a surviving syndicate operative opened a protected hard drive. The file that loaded had no metadata. No author. No creation date. Just a title. Driven Air Project. And below it, a folder. Labeled, Generation 2. The story isn't over. Not even close. If this story moved something in you, if you felt every twist, every quiet moment, every chapter that made you hold your breath, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Subscribe right now and turn on the notification bells so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like this one, layered, emotional, real, drop here regularly. And when they do, you want to be first. Drop a comment below and tell us, which moment hit you hardest? Was it Nico asking if monsters get tired? Luce Fran in the stairwell? Or Cassiel finally sleeping? Your comment might be the one that reminds someone else to keep watching. Share this with someone who needs a story worth feeling. We'll see you in the next one.